Hello, everybody. Welcome to the 2025 Write Hive Conference. My name is Hing Wen, and I'm thrilled to moderate for you today. Today, we are joined by a wonderful panel of writers, including Camilla Andrew, Tonja K. Paulette Kennedy, and Brian Lambert, to discuss the topic of Gothic fiction, atmosphere, and expectations. The Gothic has been a mainstay in media for centuries, and our panelists today will discuss what exactly is the Gothic and how it presents itself in fiction. To start, I'd like to invite our panelists to briefly introduce themselves and their work. Camilla, do you want to go first?
Yes, my name is Camilla Andrew. I am a writer of fantasy and horror. My main project is my fantasy trilogy, The Essence of the Equinox. That is a dark romantic fantasy series featuring lots of gothic elements.
Thank you. Tanja, do you want to go next?
Yes. Hi, I'm Tonja K. I write Black speculative fiction, so anything science fiction, fantasy, horror is all in my wheelhouse. I have short fiction that is published in Blue Earth Review, Violet magazine, and other publications, and I'm working on my debut novella, which is a Gothic romantasy. I am an editor at Violet magazine, and I'd love to see submissions come through if you are Black and part of the diaspora.
Right. Paulette, do you want to go next?
Sure. Hi, I'm Paulette Kennedy, and I write historical Gothic suspense. Most of my books are Southern Gothic. I'm from the Ozarks originally, and most of my books are set there. My most recent book is The Artist of Blackberry Grange, and all of my books include queer characters because I am part of the LGBTQ plus family.
Thank you. And finally, Brian.
Hi, good morning, everybody. I'm Brian Lambert, and I am a writer of Gothic, speculative fiction, a little bit of action, adventure, fantasy. By trade, I'm a comic book writer and editor. So that is what I do on most days, and we try to infuse a very noirish tone in all of our stories over at Wingless Comics.
Thank you all for introducing yourselves. So I thought we would get to maybe basics or foundations for our audience. What do you think is the essence of Gothic fiction?
So I would say the essence of Gothic fiction is that it has a lot of genre staples, lots of the theme of haunting. So you might see themes of the haunting house or deep family secrets, often transgressive topics such as exploring incest, misogyny, um, uh, violence against women, like defying patriarchal norms, that sort of thing. Uh, you also tends to have a lot of like really grandiose prose, lots of relying on atmosphere. Atmosphere. The setting is often a character in itself. So when I think of Gothic, that's the main criteria I would expect it to meet.
I always kind of default to the like it was a dark and stormy night, right? Like all of them kind of start with that kind of like you said, atmosphere and mood. So you're painting that picture of a more kind of bleak world than necessarily the one that we perceive on the daily. Also in the larger conversation, I think gargoyles, but then on the smaller conversation, I think like gargoyles, because even the cartoon and even multimedia projects that we've seen always infuse those kind of that kind of architecture, obviously, and that kind of mood. And like you said, dealing with the supernatural. I think it also deals with like a lot of immortal love um, in multiple different forms and fashions. And I think that it deals with that kind of forlorn societal look at love, women, men, and even when we're talking about like moral codes.
I think Gothic literature or fiction for me really boils down in its essence to vibes. When I open up the page to that book, do I feel like I am immersed in that world? Am I entrenched in that writing? Are the descriptions deep enough for me to feel like this is something that's living and breathing alongside with the reader? And if I can get that feeling, then oftentimes that this is a pretty good piece of Gothic literature. Um, so by vibes, I mean like how deep are we into the setting? Is it believable? Are we focusing on those five senses? Are the characters interacting with the setting in a believable manner, in a believable manner? Things of that nature. So basically, vibes.
I think my friend Chris Waldhair summed up Gothic fiction so well by calling it the marriage of dread and desire. And that's something that with my work, most of my work has a romantic subplot. And that kind of desire can be either romantic desire or it can be another kind of desire, ambition, lots of different things, the exploration of the political, as Camilla mentioned. And it just gives a great platform for talking about a lot of issues that you can couch in metaphor and symbolism.
Yeah, a lot of your answers touched specifically on atmosphere and vibes, and both Brian and Tanja talked about, the aesthetic and sensory details. So I'm curious, what do you think are methods to capture that Gothic atmosphere in fiction that either you use or you notice when you are consuming Gothic media?
So for me, I rely a lot of environmental theme setting in my fantasy trilogy. The Essence of the Equinox is very reliant on those details, especially when we get to the contrast of. So the two main countries are Solitaria, so that kind of like a Mediterranean sort of idyllic seaside realm, and Mortos, which is more of a Icelandic area. That's very overgrown, very hostile, lots of like um, greenery and wildlife, but also lots of snow and darkness. Particularly, Mortis is more like just stereotypical Gothic setting. So you get like the gloomy castle, and it's haunted by ghosts, and there's lots of like monsters roaming around outside, like just in the wildlife in general. So I kind of like rely on those details of like making everything seem really bleak and oppressive, and like there's danger at every turn. And I feel like it really helps up the stakes and the tension.
I definitely try to infuse. Paulette just mentioned like the sense of dread, and I think that that's like a very important part of Gothic writing in terms of having that foreboding. And I think that the architecture and the architecture that you choose goes into that. So in a comic medium, it's sometimes much easier because you can actually show the thing perched over them or give that visual. So in a prose, it's describing those same things. And my introduction to Gothic literature or any kind of media was, the old Dracula movies from like the Universal Pictures. And they were, done in black and white, but they could paint this really stark picture. And I think that I try to translate that when I'm writing, right? Like how you have the thunderclap right when someone says something foreboding, or you have that mysterious person that disappears that's right over your shoulder. And so I think that that part, just creating that sense of and taking the reader to where as well as the setting as a character, the reader is a character. The reader is experiencing that along with whatever main character or protagonist you have, experiencing that dread and that heart pulse pounding moment or moments throughout your story.
I often ask myself, what kind of feeling do I want to create in my reader? And if it's eerie, foreboding, do I want a slimy feel? Then after I make that list, I put bullet points of like what kind of setting details can help me create that atmosphere. So will there be a lot of gross, moldy mushrooms all around the house, or anything of that nature, like to really hit home that feeling of this is a place that is unwelcoming, that is oppressive, that generates a feeling of discomfort. And there is someone dwelling inside that discomfort, and then explore how they live within those realms. Um, I think atmosphere and setting is very much like one of the biggest pieces that we have to play with in Gothic fiction. And it's so unique in a sense that we are able to kind of go over the top in a little bit more ways than other genres are able to because it's expected. Because Gothic literature was born right off the cusp of Romanticism, and then you get those big, sweeping nature, wild, brooding moors, right? And so you're able to elevate your prose in a way as well to match that kind of over the top very dramatic emotion, very dramatic setting that you can create.
Yeah, I think it's about immersing the reader in the experience and what you're seeing through your writer's eyes. I'm a photographer as well, so I'm always thinking about details. I'm thinking about the wide angle picture that I want to immerse my reader in, but I'm also thinking of those sensory details and those small things that help build and add clues for the reader, so that when the twists and things start accelerating later in the story, they can look back and they can see these little breadcrumbs throughout. If I can go to the place that I'm writing in, the setting that I'm writing in, that helps me more than anything. Just immersing myself as the writer in that environment. As I said, a lot of my books are set in the Ozarks, which is where I'm from. I know that environment really well. But my next book is set in Charleston. So I needed to go to Charleston and experience what that atmosphere was like, and also learn a lot about the history of Charleston in order to do the story justice. So I think that it's a balancing act between getting the atmosphere on the page and also driving the story forward with pacing.
I also think what would Guillermo del Toro do? Right? Because I think that visually, right, I mean, if nothing else, he paints these amazing Gothic pictures that sometimes we're not even expecting it to be that way, right? But he's, I guess, on a mainstream way, shown like, no, you can show all this stuff and do all this stuff that's in your head that makes everything, again, much more dreadful, much more oppressive, much more to the point than we've seen previously. I also think that not current Disney, but like previous Disney used to do it really, really well. Like you had these bright, like atmospheric music, and you're listening and Belle is singing around and it's the beast, and then all the gargoyles come to life and attack somebody, right? Like it's this weird dichotomy of like you're living in this slightly twisted, slightly askew world that I think that is like a shared human experience in certain ways. But if you're doing Gothic and the atmosphere right, you just twist it just a little bit more. You freak people out just a little bit more. You make them just a little bit more uncomfortable to where they want to kind of go to the end of whatever story you're telling, whether that's the main protagonist story or the story of the world overall and the adventure you've taken them on.
Both Paulette and Camilla address kind of settings specifically in different settings to put Gothic fiction. And then Brian, I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of talking about expectations and how to like twist things with the Gothic. So I'm curious how you all try to subvert reader expectations of the genre without maybe becoming too predictable or veering too outside of what Gothic fiction typically is.
So I think in the in most of the Gothic fiction that I've read, I noticed that there's a running theme of typically a female protagonist who is defying patriarchal norms, or she's juxtaposed against like a really oppressive male figure, and he's often romantically involved with her, but she never particularly gets to challenge him in a real way. I noticed like with like Wuthering Heights, Catherine passes away and then Heathcliff like dominates the story from that. Jane Eyre ends up married to Rochester. In Rebecca, the the titular main character doesn't get a name, and we never really know her name. She's kind of overshadowed by Maxim. So to subvert that, my story is more about like making that reclamation, like taking that to its natural conclusion, where it's kind of like the male figure does get completely cast down. And I feel like that's like a kind of natural progression of like the feminist themes that we were kind of in conversation with in the past, that might have not been allowed to have progressed in a way that would way back in the past because of the expectations of women and marriage and power.
This is something that I think about quite a bit, be it that I write specifically Black speculative fiction, and my characters are all Black. Um, so what does that mean bringing it into a Gothic setting? How do I make that authentic to them and to their experiences? And that for me brings a quality of freshness. So divorcing or decentering whiteness or European centric ideas of what setting could be or or the genre conventions basically are ways that you can find newness in a genre that's been around for quite a while. Um, so specifically, what I do is I look at Black Southern Gothic fiction, and I see the ways that they have generated these sense of eeriness, right? The conversations that they have. And if you look at works like Post Sandy, um, a slave who is entrenched in this very dark atmosphere of living on a plantation, and he gets this opportunity to transform into a tree. And I don't want to spoil it for anyone who hasn't read it, but it's incredibly dark, it's incredibly visceral and oppressive. And if you look at what that Gothic fiction does as opposed to, and the classics, then you can see that there is ways to entrench newness within a genre that's been around for a long time. So I say really dig into what is your culture, what is specific to you and your traditions and your views of the world, and how you can bring that to the genre.
Tanja, on the heels of Sinners, I love everything you just said. I just want to say that because I do think that that's a very important part of everything we do and having that authentic voice in the stories that we tell. Being in the comic medium again and the indie comic medium, that's like a niche within a niche. And then when I break it down further, being a Black indie comic creator, because I'm very much like you, my stories are centered around my culture and my experiences. Um, it can feel finite, right? But like you said, there are so many ideas that we can actually explore. And I personally try to I deal with the tragedy of what I've seen in Gothic literature or how I read Gothic literature growing up. Again, when I'm talking about like these experiences with the first movies that I saw that were Gothic in nature, I thought they were pretty sad. Like I understood Frankenstein as like a tragedy. And a lot of people are like the Frankenstein monster. And I was like, no, he's really sad. Like he didn't choose to be alive again. He didn't choose to have an abnormal brain. Like this sucks for this guy, right? Like this is a horrible circumstance, but we're watching it initially, right, as a horror movie. And I think, like Camilla said, in terms of like tearing things down, I think that that's very important. When I read Paradise Lost by Milton, right? Like, it was for me again. Other people read it a certain way, and I read it as a Gothic piece. I read it as a tragedy. You see the guy who's supposed to be the guy. He's the strongest, the best, and he gets cast down, and everything he knows is now gone. And so I think that when with Gothic literature and in the time and the space we're at now, being able to subvert genres and use other calling cards of other genres in order to explore Gothic literature. That's the way I prefer to do it, right? Again, because I think a lot of the stories that we have are tragic. I think that a woman having to fight against the patriarchy every moment of her life and still, like you said, with Rebecca not even getting a name, which I think was amazing writing, by the way. But your protagonist never has a name. I think that that's a tragic story. I mean, beyond the obvious story of Rebecca being a tragedy itself. So I think that that is a good way to be able to work within some of the tropes and conventions of a genre, but take these stories and tell them a different kind of way.
Yeah, I totally agree, Brian. And I grew up in a red state in an evangelical family as a queer person. And so I all of my work is infused with my experience of that, even if I'm not directly writing about it. Like in The Devil and Mrs. Davenport, my main two characters aren't queer, but Loretta's experience in the novel is that of it's what it would feel like to be othered in some way with her mediumship. And so I use that as a metaphor for queerness and being in a red state in the Ozarks in an evangelical environment. And so I use that to kind of explore these Gothic themes of like an unreliable narrator, what is real, what is surreal, what isn't, what's your imagination or your sanity, quote unquote. And all of those like classic tropes of the isolation and such, I use to explore queer identity within a Gothic story. And it's really fun to kind of subvert and change some things and surprise readers. And I really enjoy doing that.
So you all kind of touched on things that you like to subvert and really engage in when you explore Gothic in your writing. And so I'm curious how you know you've been successful in kind of getting that in your work. Is there a way that you look at your work during revision that you could advise our audience members on kind of really figuring out like, okay, I succeeded in doing this?
I suppose you can't really tell yourself until you see the audience response. But what I like to do, because I mentioned the classics before, I'd like to make sure that whatever I'm doing is in conversation with the works of the past or even the present. You know, because the Gothic is still a genre that's still very much alive today. You know, we've seen that with things like Sinners more recently. You know, with the Southern Gothic. There's other like subsections as well. Like I know there's subsections of modern British fiction that like carries on the Gothic, but it's not in that kind of like Victorian Regency era. But so as I said, I like to be in conversation with the classics that I've read. So I kind of borrow kind of aspects of like the Byronic hero, you know, that's a very staple character mold in the genre. I infuse a lot of those traits into my male lead. My female lead is kind of like a blend of like the the kind of modern horror paradigm that a lot of fictional women get cast into. It was purposeful on my end to like kind of blend them, so she wasn't like falling into a specific misogynistic stereotype of what women could or should be. And I feel like a lot of people like kind of pick up on those themes and they interact with those themes, and especially on the romantic subplot, they're like very invested in the fact that it's very, very grandiose, but it's also very, very toxic and dysfunctional.
If you guys are getting quantitative feedback, please let me know where to go and where to find that because it's so difficult as an author or a creative, right? Because people always, I feel like people think that you already know or you've already done it, but you are waiting for them to read like your twist or your thing, and you're like you're waiting for them to catch on, and then they never tell you, and then you talk to them 3 months later, and they're like, "Oh, I thought you already knew." And you're like, "No, man, I need that from you." So I think that sometimes it's a little bit difficult to tell, but I think a great barometer. Again, I come from my medium obviously is a little bit more visual than prose. So when I get compared to some of the writers that I consider either like neo-noir or Gothic writers, I think that that's a hallmark of, hey, I've done the thing that I set out to do. And there again in this genre, there are kind of like the big names. You get like Neil Gaiman and you get Frank Miller and those guys, and they're like, oh yeah, it reminded me of, Frank Miller, right? Which is super rare. I think I've only heard that one time, right? But again, I hold that with me. I take that to heart because then that means that you did pull off whatever you were trying to do. Or if when people compare or contrast your work to another large work, if they say, oh man, after they read your piece and they say, hey, have you seen this movie from Guillermo del Toro? Or, oh, have you seen Sinners? Or have you know what I mean? Because a lot of times it's that comparison for people is how they measure what they've seen before and what they think is just as good or better in certain cases. So I feel like one, if you get your friends, not, you know, average people, but if you can get your friends to read to the end of your book or your creative endeavor, I think one, you've solved the mystery right there. And then the second part, if they can compare it to something that they've ingested before with similarities, I think that shows that you've done or you've almost achieved what you're trying to in most cases.
Yeah, to piggyback off of Brian, I think it's really important to get that reader feedback. And one thing that I do at the end of any piece that I've written is I have a questionnaire for my readers. And one of the questions that I ask is, do you have any comp titles for this work? And like I said, if like Brian said, if they put my work in conversation with someone else, like Toni Morrison or any of the other, people that I would feel like, oh my God, that's amazing. Like you think I'm in conversation with them, even accidentally, is a great indicator that you've done your job successfully. So I really, really would impress upon everyone who is thinking about writing, even if it's not Gothic literature, to go ahead and make sure that you're getting reader feedback and making sure you're asking them detailed questions at the end of the reading so that you know what they've gotten from your text?
For me, it's when I get messages from readers. I really enjoy getting messages from readers. And with The Devil and Mrs. Davenport, I heard from a lot of women who had been in abusive relationships and how they felt seen by Loretta's story, and also queer people as well. And I also, with The Artist of Blackberry Grange, got messages from people who had been caregivers and felt unseen and underappreciated for that role. And my biggest goal with my books is to create empathy in the reader and to spark conversations and to have people consider things perhaps a little differently than they had before. So that's always my goal. And it's the best compliment when you see a review say that you've become an auto-buy author. When you have built that readership to where you know that what you write has found an audience. It's really validating. And it starts early on when you're getting feedback, and beta readers and critique partners are so vital to us. And my long-term critique partner is the first person who ever reads my work, and I wouldn't be here without her.
What I've loved about this conversation is discussing kind of the Gothic as a lens to explore and heighten, Blackness and queerness and things that are not highlighted in mainstream media. And so I'm curious because I hear a lot of beginning writers who are of these backgrounds being concerned or anxious of like, well, how will my work be perceived, right? What if they don't get it? And so I'm curious if you have any advice for those beginning writers who are still kind of figuring out their voice and maybe, in my opinion, paying attention to kind of this fictional audience a little bit too much, and how you kind of dealt with that if you did.
Well, I will say it's kind of unavoidable. As soon as you release your work out for public consumption, there are going to be people who have opinions that you don't particularly agree with, who draw things from your work that were not intended by you, or are just projections of their own sort of mindset. And I feel like as someone who's been on the receiving end of harassment, in particular for the things that I write, you really do have to just kind of like kill the cop in your head regarding that. Yeah, you can't let yourself be governed and ruled by fear, especially when you're writing in a genre as transgressive as the Gothic typically is. Like sometimes the whole purpose is to discomfort people, to make them feel like dread and horror and disgust. And so when a reader does respond that way, it's important not to perceive that as like a moral failing on you. Sometimes in like especially in today's world, when we're seeing like a lot of these fascist backlashes against like literature and the written word and kind of like the freedom of speech, it's very important to realize that there is a place for fiction that is that pushes boundaries. Essentially, I think it's important that we have that space. And so, in my opinion, the best thing you can do is just ignore the critics.
I just read a quote recently, and it goes with what Paulette and Camilla just said, basically that like the absence of a generation of reading is the absence of empathy, right? Like they're creating the absence of empathy because that's where you learn empathy, in some of your first instances, you're empathizing with the character that you're going along this journey with, et cetera, et cetera. So when that's taken away, you lose that piece of development as a child. So um like Camilla said, like you have to not listen. I also have a sneaking suspicion that 9 times out of 10, the people that are criticizing you or us like that are not actually people who read the book. They didn't actually read the work, right? You get a lot of loud voices, and this is not a visual medium. We're not talking about someone's new Star Wars show that they watched and they didn't like because it didn't reflect the way they think Star Wars should go. We're talking about people who sat down and dedicated the time to read hundreds of pages. And I doubt seriously that the people are the loudest about whatever you've written have actually read what you've put out. So you have to not listen, right? You have to take quality feedback. Well, you should take quality feedback, right? Because that helps you. But if someone is just spouting hate, how does that help at all? What does that do? So yeah, there's no point listening because at the end of the day, if you listen and then you stop producing because you listened, then you're back at the square one of where you never produced anything. And that's not a place you want to be. You don't want to live your life with regrets of having not told your story, of having not let those words out. Because again, you never know who you could help. If you help one person, you've done you know, your life's work. If you can change one person's mind, you've done your life's work. So there's no reason to not do that because of one loud, wrong, ignorant person, especially in our proliferated internet age, right? You're going to have that, and they're not important at all. Your work is.
I think it's also important for you as a writer to decide at the onset of your writing, who is your audience? Who are you telling this story to? And narrow that down as fine as possible. For me, I'm writing primarily for Black American women, and I'm using language and themes and symbolism that they would generally understand because we are of the same culture. So if they understand my story, I have done my job, right? Of course, I'm not only selling stories to Black American women. There's going to be other people who read and do not understand because they are not of the culture. And they're going to have some things that they stumble on and they're like, I don't understand this. For example, the story that is in the book here, um, I talk about chitlins, and there were readers who were like, I don't understand what chitlins are. I don't know what is a chitlin? And and so I'm like, okay, well,
Eesh.
do I take that extra beat of time to put that detail that chitlins is a food? Well, obviously I talked about, it's boiling, it doesn't smell nice. The child has run out of the house because they don't want to smell it anymore. They're just tired of it, right? But their grandma loves to cook it. So it's on the stove boiling. And they are talking about how it's just offensive. They don't like the smell and they're outside, right? So do I take that little bit of extra detail time to say chitlins smells like excrement or anything else? But anybody who's of my culture who's understanding, or maybe even Southern, would understand what chitlins are, how they smell. They're not too pleasant, but they can often taste pretty darn good if that's your thing to eat. Um, it's just your choice then. How far do you want to lean into the other person's gaze? How willing are you to explain yourself and your choices? If you don't want to explain, you don't have to. Like I said before, removing the white gaze is a choice. So if I want my work to be broadly understood by someone, I will have to take that time to put in that little extra beat of detail so that someone who is othered from my culture can understand what I'm talking about. And if they don't understand, they may criticize because they are not of, and that is okay too. So just understanding who your audience is and who you are specifically writing the story to is, I think, one of the primary functions that you need to think about when you're starting a story.
I love when I'm inspired to research and look something up when I'm reading. I don't need it all explained on the page because part of being one of the things I love about being a historical fiction writer is that I don't know everything and it inspires me to go do my own research. But going back to what we were talking about earlier with people telling authors to avoid certain subjects, I see that a lot right now. Authors shouldn't be political. I think that comes down to people don't like a mirror being held up to them. They don't like having to consider that they might be wrong about something. And I think it's really important as authors to know your voice, to know your audience, to know who you're speaking to and what you want to say, and to go forth boldly to do that. And to remember why you're doing, what your message is, and to stay true to that. And you will have naysayers no matter what. Even if you pander and fawn to every single reader out there, you're still going to have readers that don't like your work. So ultimately, it comes down to just being true to yourself and your voice.
Thank you all for that advice. So going back to Gothic fiction, what do you think are some misconceptions about the genre that folks have? And how would you correct them?
I suppose the idea that the Gothic is only from a certain time period or a certain body of literature. As I mentioned before, I feel like the Gothic genre is still very much alive and well and being contributed to, like in the modern day, across genres. Like, you know, we have like Gothic fantasy now, or we have elements of Gothic in like science fiction with like dystopia, and cyberpunk. I feel like those touch on a lot of those themes, especially the transhumanism, like acknowledging like what it means to be human, and emotions, and how we're driven by like love and fear and prejudice. And so yeah, I would mainly say you don't have to read the classics, but I do think you do have to interact with the classics to understand the beginnings of the genre, and like what it was trying to say at the time, even if it says it imperfectly. Like, you know, you get like texts like Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights, and their perspective on race was very imperial, from an imperial colonialist lens. And even though they're not purposely trying to be racist, you can see that a lot of those biases leak through, and portray their characters of color in a very dehumanizing way. And so I feel like that's why, you know, contributions with Black creators like Tonja and Brian are very important to the genre, to like to carry on that conversation. So yeah, it's not all stodgy old literature, but I do think it's important to know the genesis of the genre, and to know that it's still very much alive.
I think a very, I hate saying popular, but popular misconception is that like everybody doesn't belong, which is something that's kind of a popular catchphrase in all of media and all of writing and all of fantasy right now, which is like a terrible place to be when you're talking about it's like 2025 and people are still doing that, which is very strange. But I remember a few years back, Tim Burton basically said that like black people didn't fit his aesthetic, and he's one of the most well-known Gothic, you know, directors, writers, creators out there, right, in the past, you know, X amount of years. And to have the gall to kind of get up and say something that really makes zero sense, right, on a world stage, and have people follow that. I think that's one of the problematic pieces of what we do, and kind of demystifying that part of it, right? I think that, and I go to obviously like a lot of transmedia and a lot of movies because a lot of times they get just a bigger stage, they have a bigger platform just by nature of what they're doing. But you have something like what was it, the Last Voyage of the Demeter, right? Like that, obviously, right? It's a Dracula story, so obviously that has gothic elements, even though it's like horror, you know, on and on and on. And you see that the protagonist in there is a black man, and I think that that kind of thing is important. I think that shifting that paradigm and continuing to put queer characters and continuing to put Black women and continuing to put people of color in these mainstay positions is incredibly important to, as Camilla said, showing people that this is like a live, thriving genre, right? It's not the dusty old white man. It's not the thing that it used to be. Just because it's gothic doesn't mean old, right? It doesn't mean old timey. And I think that that's incredibly important that we continue to do that so we can continue to demystify this genre that obviously we're all doing very well with, right? It's something that we all love and we all can create in. So it's important that we continue to do that so that we change the face of what the genre is. So the genre's face is not the past.
I think Brian said that so wonderfully. Demystifying is that keyword that I pulled there, and making sure that we're putting this representation forward is immensely important, not only for the people that you are representing, but for people who are other end digesting the media as well. So they can then be opened up to new experiences and ideas and conversations. Um, on like I guess a micro level, not to like just reiterate the points that have already been made. I've heard that Gothic fiction can be preachy or slow paced or boring, because you do have to take that time to invest in setting and atmosphere. So it can feel like it's slowed down some, but I think a lot of the contemporary stories that I've read are a lot more fast paced, They are more aligned with how readers like to enjoy stories nowadays. And so we have a lot of really good literature that is out there right now. And so if you're not interested in going back and reading the stuff that you might consider boring, look at some things that are newer and you might feel compelled to enjoy those more.
I think one of the biggest misconceptions that I see is that Gothic isn't horror fiction. And it's under that umbrella, and it was one of the first forms of horror fiction. And also, a lot of contemporary readers, the first time they encounter Gothic fiction, they don't quite know what it is. So you'll see a lot of confusion. Is this suspense? Is this a thriller? Is this a romance? And it's all of those things, and all of those things help encapsulate Gothic fiction. And so I think a lot of it is just exposure to Gothic. I think Gothic is enjoying a renaissance right now, which is wonderful. People are picking up on something we've all known for a long time, which is great. But I think sometimes with readers who are new to it, they often feel like the author doesn't know what genre they're writing in, or they're confused, or they're trying to include everything. And it's just, that's Gothic. It's a little bit of all of those things.
You all discussed kind of, not necessarily having to reach into the past and looking towards the future when it comes to Gothic, which I really loved. Do you have any recommendations for either recent Gothic media you like or even going into the past, but any media that our audience can kind of check out and see examples of Gothic fiction you think has been done well?
So for a historical example, I will always recommend reading Rebecca. Definitely one of my favorite examples of the genre. I feel like it's very integral. It's really got everything that you could possibly want. It's got the haunted house, the deep dark secret, the brooding man, the very complex cast of like female characters who occupy different roles. The prose is also very beautiful. And for a modern example, I would suggest Deathless by Catherine Valente. I feel like it carries on the tradition very well. Lots of beautiful prose, lots of intense imagery. It's got the very toxic, dysfunctional, romantic subplot at the core. It deals with a lot of themes of like love and death, and a very turbulent time in Russian history as well, with the rise of communism. So I definitely recommend that as well.
I'm a big old kid at heart. Obviously, I'm doing comic books for a living, so I got to be a child in some form or fashion. But I definitely I tell people to watch Gargoyles all the time, and I realize it's an American cartoon, right? But the writing is so deep and so layered, honestly, for being like a supposed child's cartoon. So when I'm trying to introduce people to something lighter, but it has all those elements, I'll say something like, again, I'll say Gargoyles any day. Um, I also think Needful Things and Salem's Lot by Stephen King, even though those always get put in the horror genre, I agree with Paulette that horror is Gothic and Gothic is horror, depending on how you're writing it. Again, I'm a big transmedia guy, so anything by Guillermo del Toro, you're going to have that Gothic element to it. I also think that Sinners, if anybody hasn't seen Sinners, I need everybody to go watch Sinners because it definitely does that, like we talked about with the Southern Gothic. Um, and yeah, I mean, there are quite a few, and I think that one of the most important parts about exploring Gothic literature and themes that are Gothic is kind of expanding what you believe Gothic to be. Like Paulette said, like it encompasses so many genres. And I hadn't really thought about it, but I believe Camilla said, when we're talking about like dystopian futures and cyberpunk. And I was like, as soon as she said it, I was like, oh yeah, duh. Like it makes so much sense. So there are so many elements that you can really explore with regard to that.
I definitely think some really good ones would be Reformatory by Tanana Ridu. Pretty much anything by her I feel is excellent. Kindred by Octavia Butler, Beloved by Toni Morrison, and Their Eyes Were Watching God by Nora Neale Hurston. Even though those are a bit older, I think those really encapsulate what Black Gothic fiction can look like, and the ways that you can take our history and our experiences and create something that feels fresh within the genre.
When the Reckoning Comes by LaTanya McQueen is one of the best books I've ever read. Southern Gothic, very intense, about a Black woman who returns to her segregated small Southern town for her white friend's plantation wedding. And it is one of those books that will stay with you for a long time. The Hacienda by Isabel Cañas, excellent Gothic fiction. And my current read is a newer writer. It's kind of hard to see because of the green screen, but Where Dark Things Grow by Andrew K. Clark. He writes Appalachian Gothic with a lot of religious subtext. Very excellent. So there are so many. And also just my good friend Hester Fox, she writes kind of like that classic Gothic feeling fiction, but she subverts it with lots of feminist themes. So she's also great.
So to kind of pull it back to all of your works, I'm curious during the writing process when you know it's Gothic. Do you set out to write a story that's Gothic? Is it at the premise stage, or does it kind of evolve during your writing process? And if this had something, this was present in any recent works, I'd love to hear about that as well.
So I don't think I ever really set out to create Gothic. Oh, well, for my current project, Essence of Equinox, I did set out to write Gothic fiction, but I noticed that I'm currently working on a new project now. That's more of a literary psychodrama. I am noticing that a lot of Gothic elements are like appearing. So it's got that same brooding male lead, a deep dark secret, the sort of like setting of a character. So it features London. London is like, a very staple setting for like Gothic fiction. So I feel like because it's a genre that I read a lot and interact with a lot, I think it's natural that themes will appear in my work, especially because I write a lot about the intersections of like gender and race and power dynamics a lot, both in my fantasy and in my literary fiction. So I feel like those particular subjects are like rife for potential of like exploring Gothic themes, because that's kind of the whole point of the genre, to like explore transgression and pushing it back against the old order with the new order.
I found myself, I guess, kind of drawn to the genre on accident. I think, like Camilla, I don't know that I necessarily set out to do it, but like I said, some of my first experiences were with it. I was a huge, and still am, I guess, in certain respects, a fan of Frank Miller's writing, as a comic book writer, and Alan Moore, and so they have that very gothic tone. So within uh Justice Volume One, which is behind me here. That was my first trade paperback, my first graphic novel. And it's very gothic in terms of like Camilla said, tearing down the old with the new, having that mystery, having that immortal love, like all of these little elements that go into it and make the genre. I also feel like the material that we consume, I think one of my favorite in the last couple years was Lovecraft Country. And I loved how just everything was laid out. Again, I had read the novel a while back, but then seeing it on screen and some of the changes and some of the, I think, necessary changes, honestly, and how it was done differently was amazing. And I think that that has influenced and informed what I've done moving forward in terms of how I present what I want to present in that same respect.
My short piece, Thunder Gone Fire, was awarded the 2024 Minnesota BIPOC Emerging Writer Award. And when I first wrote it, I didn't think it was Gothic until people was like, "Oh, I love this Southern Gothic thing you wrote." And I was like, "Oh, you're right." I think what draws me to the genre is the drama, is the big sweeping emotion, and the way that you can play with setting. Um, so do I set out to do it? Usually no, now more intentionally with my writing, but I grew up being a big Edgar Allan Poe lover, The Raven, like all those stories like really, really captured me as a young girl. And so I think having those as a backdrop for my writing have encouraged me to write stories that follow that same vein and have that same emotional pulse going through them.
Yeah, like Tonja, I grew up reading those stories. My mom loved Gothic fiction. She introduced me to Jane Eyre at a young age, and I started reading all of Daphne du Maurier's work, V.C. Andrews. I'm a child of the 80s and 90s. What can I say? Um, Basically, I write Gothic fiction because it's what I love to read, and it gives me a vehicle to discuss and interrogate the issues that I want to talk about as a queer person, in a way that's also entertaining for the reader. And so that's why I keep gravitating back to it. Will I ever write anything else besides Gothic fiction? I won't say never, possibly, but it is my first love and my truest love. And it's something that I am not showing any signs of getting tired of writing.
All right, thank you all so much. I have a long list of things to read and watch after this. And to end, I'm giving you space to give any last thoughts or final thoughts you wanted to share with our audience regarding writing or Gothic fiction, and also to plug yourself and your work. So let folks know where to find you and where to buy your books.
So you can currently find me under my imprint name, which is An Inkwell of Nectar. I am on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook. I'm also on Twitter under Inkwell of Nectar. So that's Inkwell of Nectar with the AN chopped off. Also on Bluesky, so that's with the full username, An Inkwell of Nectar. I also have a website, aninkwellofnectar.com, and a personal bookstore where you can buy special editions of my books.
You can find Wingless Comics and myself, obviously, on all social media under Wingless Comics. We also have our website, www.winglessent, as in entertainment.com. You can find all of our books there. We are on Facebook. We are on Instagram. We are on TikTok. We left Twitter because it's a dumpster fire. Uh, and we are firmly committed to just creating great stories and creating new narratives for people like ourselves who don't get to see ourselves in media.
Okay, you guys can find me at tonjakjohnson.com, on all social media at the same handle, Tonja K Johnson. I'm primarily on Threads, Instagram, and YouTube. But I play a little bit on all of them, but it gets tiring. Uh, um, I have my debut novella coming out at the end of this year, and that is a Gothic romantasy. So please follow me for updates on that. And I am an acquiring editor at Faya magazine. So if you are hoping to publish a short story or a novelette, you can go ahead and visit our website at fayalitmag.com and visit our submission requirements. I would love to see your story come through.
You can find me at my website, paulettekennedy.com, and on Instagram and Threads at pkennedywrites. And I do a monthly newsletter. That's how I keep in touch with my readers most of all. And you can subscribe to that on my website.
All right, thank you all, and thank you all for joining us today. There are many other wonderful sessions as part of 2020 Write Hive, so I recommend you take a peek at the schedule and check some of them out. But thank you so much, and happy writing.